Please be seated. I want to begin by offering a word of thanks to Susie and to Dave to inviting me to be here with you this morning. It's my delight to answer that call. This is the fourth time I've preached from this pulpit, twice during the pandemic to an empty house. And my candidating sermon, or my neutral pulpit sermon when I was being hired at Los Altos was preached here back in 2015. But this is my first time to be in this pulpit with a full house and as a member of this worshiping community, and it's a true delight. I also want to thank Julie for the amazing choices in music today. It's been just a treat of a mini concert already. Will you pray with me? Most Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts bring glory to you and renewal to our spirits. Amen. In the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama was one of the most segregated cities in the country. In 1962, a group of students from Miles College, a nearby historically black college, led a boycott of Birmingham's downtown stores in protest of the segregated policies separating dressing rooms, restrooms, and water fountains for white only and blacks, or in that day, colored. The boycott was successful, and community leaders agreed to take down the whites-only signs, and a few of the signs at some of the water fountains did disappear for a while. About a year later, or 6 months later, at the invitation of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Birmingham to protest the city's actions or lack thereof. And because a judge had just issued an emergency injunction against any kind of demonstration or protest in the city of Birmingham, Martin Luther King and many of his supporters were arrested and held in jail for 8 days. By the way, these nonviolent arrests required a bail of, in today's dollars, $1.65 million. After the arrest, a group of 8 white clergymen published an open letter, which was called A Call for Unity, in the local paper. And Dr. King's letter from Birmingham Jail was his response to those clergymen. Now, if one were to take the clergyman's letter completely out of its context and read it simply at face value, it seems like a reasonable letter. It asked the citizens of Birmingham to back away from illegal activity, as well as from any planned protests, and implored them to rely on the rule of law and the court system to right any societal wrongs. Now, one of the things that I have said most often in my sermons is, just as the 3 most important words in real estate are location, 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 the 3 most important words in biblical study or any social science kind of review are context, context, context. And this also applies to our reading of this letter. Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham Jail applied the context that those clergy writers had left out. He reminded them of the lifetimes of mistreatment and violence toward the black community. We cannot ignore one another's cries for justice because, as he wrote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects all. We cannot anymore quietly wait for the courts to right these wrongs. Not when, he wrote, Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. For years, we have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless effort of men and women willing to be co-workers with God. These two letters, read side by side, fill me with righteous indignation, as I imagine they do you as well. But the letter from those 8 clergymen also breaks my heart. The authors of that letter were bishops of the Catholic, Episcopal, and Methodist churches, the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Alabama, a Jewish rabbi, and a Baptist minister. They were in positions of both power and authority with far-reaching influence over the worshiping communities and the lives of their members all across the state of Alabama. Can you imagine what might have happened if, instead of telling black citizens of Birmingham to sit down, those 8 men stood up and called for God's justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream? Whom might they have influenced for the good? Instead, they advocated for the unjust status quo. My heart also breaks because these men so completely missed the entire point of the gospel story. The gospel story in Jesus' ministry never supported the status quo. The gospel is about transformation. The gospel is about justice. It's about allowing love and compassion and generosity to so infuse our living that we have no choice but to work for justice so that all of God's children are safe and warm and fed and loved. It would be pretty easy to dismiss those 8 clergymen as gutless or unfaithful or even complicit. But I've tried to summon my better angels and attempt to understand why they wrote and acted in the way that they did. And what I keep coming back to is actually pretty simple: fear. An article in Psychology Today a few years back said that fear was the most powerful motivator for human behavior. It's no wonder that our politicians talk fear all the time. It works. I've no doubt that those men were afraid of the potential violence, even bloodshed that might result from those demonstrations. They may have been afraid of violence against them or their families that could have accompanied a more justice-seeking position. How many bricks got thrown into living room windows during those challenging years? They might have been afraid of the ridicule or loss of standing, or perhaps even loss of their jobs if they took a more radical stand for justice. We're all motivated by fear. Sometimes our fears are about big things like violence and unrest. Some of you here today have known the special fear that comes in wartime. But we also live with everyday fears. Fears like loss of face or loss of position. Fear of being found out that we're not as good as we want people to think that we are. We can get stuck in our fears. We worry there won't be enough money, enough time, enough goodness, enough kindness, enough attention, enough companionship, enough. We become limited by our fears of scarcity. We try to grab hold of and hang on to what we can for fear that we somehow might lose it all. What are the fears that motivate you? What are the fears that make you clench your fists and hold things tight? But, oh, beloved community, that is not God's desire for us. God desires not that we live with fear and scarcity, but with abundance. I came that you might have life, Jesus said, and that you have it abundantly. Today's story that Gail read a few minutes ago of the wedding in Cana and the miracle of water into wine illustrate what is one of the most basic principles of the gospel: abundance. I love this story because in the Gospel of John, this is Jesus' first public act. Often in our lectionary readings, it's the story that comes right after the baptism of Jesus, which we celebrated last Sunday. And this story of abundance sets the stage for all that is to come in John's Gospel. In this story, there's a human need. Mary notices it, brings it to Jesus' attention. Jesus responds. And where there was scarcity, suddenly there is fullness and abundance and goodness. So there's 4 things about this story that I want to very briefly highlight that catch my attention. The opening words of this text are 3 days later. Other translations say, on the 3rd day. Well, 3 days after what? It doesn't say. 3 days after the story that started on the Jordan River? Maybe. But some scholars suggest that this first miracle happening on the 3rd day is a foreshadowing of the resurrection event that happens on the 3rd day after Jesus' death. Maybe they suggest this story is not about an event in a particular time and place, but by locating it on the 3rd day, it's the author's way of saying that this is what resurrected living looks like. What was empty is made full. Where there was scarcity, there is plenty. The second thing I notice in this story is Mary, the mother of Jesus. She said, they're out of wine. Jesus said, not my problem. She said to the waitstaff, do whatever he tells you. Now, I think that Jesus might be saying to himself, did she not hear what I just said? And Mary, I think, might have just given him the hand and walked away. Just do it. A third interesting thing beyond mother-son dynamics are another interesting thing in the story are the water pots themselves and the quantity that they represent. The text says that there were 6 stoneware pots, and these were used for the ceremonial cleansing and washing that was a regular part of first century Judaism. Hands were washed before eating, utensils were washed before preparing a meal, and so it makes sense that there would be empty pots there. The guests who had arrived, who had just drunk all of the wine, had cleansed themselves when they got there. But I want you to have a real sense of scale about these pots. These water pots held 20 to 30 gallons each. There were 6 of them. And if you consider that a modern bottle of wine holds 750 milliliters, then these pots would have held a total of about 900 bottles of wine. That's a lot of wine. And then the fourth thing I want to point out in this story is the goodness of that wine. This is the good stuff. And in listening to the narrative voice, we could almost see it, smell it, taste it. It's sensual, like so much in the Gospel of John. There's drinking and feeling and tasting. In John, we read a lot about the drink of living water and the abundance of good-tasting wine and wading into healing pools. Now, as social creatures, one of the ways that we best understand ourselves is through story, through narrative. Stories invite us in, and as we inhabit the skin of another within the context of the story, we begin to see and understand the world in a bigger, fuller, more expansive way. One method of biblical study is to read the story several times, but intentionally paying attention to each of the characters or circumstances in the story, trying to experience it from a new perspective, and learn what we might discover of God in the exercise. So I imagine we've mostly read or heard this story, maybe as one of the disciples, or as a guest at the wedding, just an observer who witnesses something spectacular and then begins to understand and see Jesus in a new way. And by intentionally looking at the story from that perspective, we are aware of God's delight in generosity and abundance. What if we focus on the caterer, who has planned and prepared and hired wait staff and ordered the food and arranged the decoration? At the height of the festivities, the wine has run out. Have you ever been caught up short? Have you ever had the bottom fall out? Where do you turn? Who has your back? If we look at the story from the caterer's perspective, we might learn something about God's presence and sufficiency, even in times of anxiety and fear. What if we turn our gaze to Mary, a woman, a mother, someone who sees what's going on and quietly goes behind the scenes to the one person she thinks can fix the problem and says, just do it? Are there times when you've had to keep your nose to the grindstone, grit your teeth, and just get this done? I'm reminded of other stories in the Bible when it's acts of persistency that have God's will and graciousness made manifest. And what of Jesus? He hesitates. It's not his time. I don't know what that means. Does he think he's not ready yet? Is he afraid? Is he worried he's going to fail? Have you ever not felt ready yet to do that next hard thing to which God calls you? Looking at the story from this perspective reminds me that sometimes we need to get out of our own ways. Maybe our own timetables and intentions are not the same as God's, and we have to respond to the need and the urging around us, whether we feel ready to or not. And what of those water pots, those huge, empty, heavy, dry vats? They get filled, and not just filled, but filled to the brim, overflowing with water that is transformed into something that is valuable and precious and tasty. Might they not represent the arid and desert times in our lives? How might we survive those times if we remember that God's power can transform our living into richness and generosity and abundance? This is an epiphany story. And epiphanies are embodied revelations, manifestations of God's presence that we can sense. The wedding miracle at Cana reveals that epiphanies are experiences of God's love so abundant that you can sense it in every part of your body. And so may we be filled to the brim with God's abundant love and grace. And may that abundance give us the courage we need to do the urgent work of justice. Amen.